Okay. Okay, hello, I'm back, and welcome again for the second part of the conference of today. It's called "It Makes Us Think of a Dance and a Fête as Much as of War," and in brackets, on violence. And maybe I just tell for those who had not been here before the break, we had basically 3 presentations, one film screening by Jean-Luc Godard, a very impressive presentation by Hadrien and Laroche on the question of violence and language, and how violence does arrive in language, and the book could become a murder through the work by Jean Genet. And we had a very poetic and a very different performative poetic presentation by Yasmine Eid-Sabbagh on a collection of images that she was entrusted with, and struggling with the question how to make these images public without exhibiting them as material spaces. So this afternoon now we are continue with 3 more presentations before the final discussion. The first presentation is going to be by Paulo Tavares, also more an experimental presentation. And then before Paulo talks, I tried to connect with Milica Tomić. She could not come to Dublin because her visa was not granted. She has a Serbian citizenship, and it was just not possible. So she has to speak from over there, and her presentation is called "Who is Singing Over There?" So it's a conceptual coincidence with the violence for her not being here and her contribution. And then Mercedes Azpilicueta, she is going I have to make this joke now. Mercedes has been studying with me for 2 years, and I didn't know how to pronounce her last name until today really properly. So whenever I talk Azpilicueta and I look at Mercedes, we have to laugh. And it also connects actually basically to her performance, because she's doing a poetry speech performance, so where the sound of the voice, the sonic phase of the voice, is a crucial instrument through which she is reflecting on a 1-year reading group on violence. And then the final discussion will consist of a response by Denise Ferreira da Silva, who's going to introduce a rather theoretical framework again on the concept of violence, but also linking it up very distinctively and particularly with the contributions of the day. And it also will enable us to make that link between the juridical dimension with regard to justice, injustice, violence, and artistic practice. So how can we connect these 2 different scopes that seem to be so distant from each other? So I call Milica before I introduce Paulo, sorry. And just to, I will do it later. I think I will do it when I'm on my chair. So, because now it's Paulo Tavares. I'm very grateful and happy again that Paulo came over to Dublin. He extended his stay in Europe for another week for us to come here. He is based in Ecuador, in Quito, and in London. And we have been in touch around violence, a conversation for a few years, since Paulo has been working on the archaeology of violence by Pierre Clastres, a Latin American anthropologist who has developed a concept around violence as a defense of society against the state. And Paulo was born in Brazil. He is an architect and urbanist based in Quito and London. And his work is concerned with the relations between conflict and space as they intersect within the multi-scalar arrangements of cities, of territories, and ecologies. Grounded on research-based methodologies and commitment to fieldwork, Tavares' practice combines design, media-based cartographies, and writing as interconnected modalities of reading contemporary spatial conditions. He's currently developing a project on the violence of planning and the politics of ecology in Amazonia at the PhD program of the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths, University of London. And Paulo teaches architecture at the Universidad Católica de Ecuador, and he has previously had teaching positions at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths and at the Visual Lab of the MA program in Contemporary Art Theory, also at the Goldsmiths in London. And his talk is called Archaeology of Violence. So please join me in welcoming Paulo Tavares for his presentation.
Okay, this has to be here. First of all, thank you, Doreen, very much for inviting me to be in this panel. Thank you, all the people from EVA International, Bassam El Baroni. Also, I'd like to thank Noel. I'm very happy to be here to have this moment to show you some of my recent work. And I think Doreen was very precise in saying that I would try to show how violence is inscribed in the landscape, but not only inscribed, but how landscape is in fact a medium of violence and rights violations, and ultimately its victim, land being a victim of violence, and the earth itself being a victim of violence. So we saw the film by Godard, which is a film about violence, and you saw lots of human figures. So perhaps my task here is to bring the ground to the front stage and show how there is a mode of violence and a mode of political violence directed to the land. I'd like to show you two projects I have been involved, developed in the context of the Center for Research Architecture with other colleagues in a project called Forensic Architecture, and these projects connect two forest landscapes, one in Mesoamerica and the other one in lowland Amazonia. And it's important to connect these two projects. Some brief words about what connect these projects. First of all, they engage in a particular historical period, the Cold War, which was a period of strong belief in the powers of planning, in the power of urban and regional planning and architecture. Spatial designs were conceived as fundamental vectors that would lead radical transformations in social relations, chiefly in the Third World, where planning was perceived as the force that would drive societies out of backwardness, out of underdevelopment. This was also a period which most of these countries, most of Latin America, were controlled by military regimes and were really ravaged by what they so-called dirty wars, military regimes that ruled by means of political violence. And there's a kind of intimate relation between spatial transformation, the reorganization of territory, and political violence, and this is what I'm going to try to show to you a little bit. But also what connects these projects is that they are forest landscapes, and forest landscapes are somehow foreigner space to the discipline of architecture. Insofar as we are concerned with modifications of the landscape, we tend to think that forests are this sort of third space against which the discipline defines itself. It's a resource of nature, of naturalness, and somehow, therefore, it is a space, a landscape against which the discipline defines itself. So my task here is to bring the forest as a historical, political space and try to think what it would mean for us to understand the landscapes within which we live. So the first part concerns Guatemala. Guatemala suffered one of the most brutal of the dirty wars in Latin America. Hundreds of thousands of people were either killed, extrajudicially killed, or forcibly disappeared during this conflict. The aim of this research that we have conducted was to support evidentiary material for a specific trial, the trial of former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, who is accused of genocide against the Maya Xil people, which is an indigenous group that lives in the Chuchuchumatas mountains in the highlands of Guatemala. And to produce a map of this particular moment of the conflict is not only a matter of cartographic description. The reconfiguration of the territory, as I will try to show, the destruction and construction of the environment, both the built and the natural environment, the violent transformation of spatial relations between people and things, were key elements in the military strategy to defeat political resistance. By the early 70s, guerrilla groups started to set base within the forests of the Ixil territory. Protected by a mountainous landscape of hills, intricate valleys, and dense forests, the Ixil territory still remains a zone of difficult penetration. Back in the early 80s, we are talking about 78 until 86, likewise much of the western highlands of Guatemala, access to this region was severely limited by poor infrastructures. Further, the geography of Maya inhabitation, traditionally organized in dispersed networks of small hamlets, hidden at the folds of mountains and valleys, made it even harder to map and navigate the Ixil territory. Whereas from the perspective of the guerrilla, of the armed movements, this complex social natural topography provided an excellent terrain of operations. For the military, it consisted of an enemy in itself. That is to say, the landscape had to be defeated. The military conceived the counterinsurgency strategy in terms of an inversion of one of the most famous aphorisms of Mao Zedong. The guerrilla must move amongst the people as a fish swims in the sea. What the sea is to the fish, the civilian population is to the guerrillas, an essential logistical and biophysical source of support and survival. The military strategy was therefore based on the idea that it was necessary to drain the water from the region, that is to say, break up the ties between rebels and civilians, waging war against the guerrillas through the elimination of its supposedly social base of support. It's important to note there is a kind of like ecological conception in the way that violence is deployed. And it's not a random or by chance definition. There is, Cold War is a moment in which there is an intrinsic ecological dimension to forms of violence. So in order to achieve this objective, that is to depopulate, to drain the water, the military attempt in order to drain the water, the military attempt to depopulate the Ixil region by conducting a series of massacres, collective killings against local villages throughout the Ixil triangle. And I'm going to show some of those maps. So here, what you see is the Ixil, the so-called Ixil triangle, with these three main cities, and it was occupied by a series of military bases. It was a completely military siege, and the military went on committing massacres, which is to say collective killings. And these yellow dots are the patterns of massacres from 81 until 86. Violence was not limited to human bodies, that is to say, against the subjects, collective killing, but also against architecture. Massacres were most often anticipated or followed by the nearly complete destruction of the material infrastructures of villages, houses, public facilities, religious buildings, etc. Between 70 to 9% of the Ixil communities that existed in this region before the violence had completely been destroyed in the early 80s as a result of the military offensives. So what you see here in the red crosses are the villages that have been destroyed. So there is a kind of overlapping between violence against people and violence against the built environment. So after mapping this pattern of violence, we analyzed a series of Landsat of satellite images. Images from 79 and 86, which is bracketed the period of violence. And what we're trying to understand and how violence transformed the landscape itself. And this is what we call scorched earth, and I will explain. So by analyzing these maps, we did a series of remote sensing analysis. So what you see here is an image of 1979. I'm going to show this one. It's an image of 1979. And the areas in blue are areas which are deforested without forest. And the areas in red are areas which have heavy forest, presence of dense vegetation. So what you can see that in this image, after the violence, there is a radical deforestation around those three cities, right? Where some areas which were deforested here had regained vegetation cover. And this transformation in the landscape, to read this transformation in this landscape is really important. So if we zoom in, it becomes clearer that there was kind of concentration of population here in those areas because of deforestation, and some areas on the top had regained vegetation. In those maps, we also did some of these analysis, and you can see, for example, that those kind of darker purple bubble shapes, they signal the destruction of forest areas. They sign deforestation, right? So by doing a series of analysis in satellite images, we can understand the change in patterns of land use in this area. The decrease of vegetation, the transformation of patterns of vegetation cover were not simply a collateral effect of the chaos unleashed by state terror, but in fact was an integral and intrinsic dimension of the actions conducted by military forces. On the wake of mass slaughters perpetrated against hundreds of indigenous communities and the destruction of entire villages, animals were killed, agricultural fields were burned, and large-scale deforestation took place. This was part of what the army called scorched earth offensives. So again, we see the kind of ecological metaphor in order to describe a military strategy, in order to describe a form of violence, a particular form of violence, which is not just addressed to a particular subject, but in fact to entire architecture, entire landscape. And this is crucial to understand. So, for example, this is just to illustrate. This is one of the milpas, fields of corn, kind of traditional mode of agriculture of the Maya. And this was the agricultural fields that the military were burning. So these dark purple spots that you see, they signal this kind of the burning of this type of landscape. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
No puedes entender la violencia solamente hacia las personas, sino también hacia su entorno, por supuesto. Si se escondían, si comían de la tierra, de la montaña, también eso era atacado. El pensamiento indígena es muy diferente al pensamiento occidental. Hay una relación con el territorio, con las montañas, constante. Es como, ¿cómo te podría decir? Animismo. El animismo. No se atacó solo a las personas, sino se atacó todo un modo de vida. Y cuando el modo de vida está relacionado íntimamente con la naturaleza, ellos lo sabían, ellos lo planificaron, ellos hicieron lo que hicieron.
¿Hablan de animismo?
Sí.
¿Los militares hablan de esto?
hablan de eso. En sus documentos oficiales tienen muy bien estudiado la religión maya, tienen muy estudiadas las costumbres, tienen muy estudiado las montañas sagradas y cuáles son. Y cabalmente esas montañas sagradas fueron quemadas, fueron bombardeadas. En esas montañas sagradas es también donde mucha población se refugió. Y dicen, la montaña nos salvó, porque nos cubrió, por los árboles no nos miraban, bajaban las nubes y los helicópteros no podían vernos.
In attempting to separate people from land, prompting mass displacement by fracturing the physical and cultural bonds between territory and population, the military resorted to a form of environmental violence that was consciously designed to shrink local conditions of habitat and make the life of indigenous community materially unsustainable. State terror turned into a form of ecological terror. Insofar as the spatiality of Mayan forms of inhabitation was considered as a threat in itself, outside and refractory to state control, territorial reorganization became a fundamental element of the counterinsurgency. Massive destruction was just one side of a double-edged strategy designed to completely reconfigure the social geography of this region, of which the complementary part was an equally violent and ambitious project of reconstruction. This project of reconstruction was known as the military's developmental philosophy. On the ground, it translated into what the military called the programs of poles of development. A series of projects, humanitarian relief, socio-economic assistance, agricultural modernization, changing land tenure system, infrastructural building were mobilized as a low-intensity counterinsurgent tactics, functioning to amplify military occupation and control of Mayan lands and community. The most important element in this reconstruction of destroyed landscape was what the military called the model villages. Doesn't work. Let me do like this. Sorry. 2 weeks later, the army came back and destroyed the remaining house and burned agricultural fields. This is one of the histories of one of these model villages. I want to show you some images, what they look like. In 1982, the military built a model village on the top of the ruins. So I will cut. I just want to show how there was a process of radical reurbanization of this area. Here in the blue points, what you see are the points of the model villages. In red, what you see is deforestation. And in the green areas, which you cannot really see properly, but the green areas where forest recovered. So the regrowth of the forest signaled that population had been displaced from this area, whereas the deforestation signaled this process of concentration of the population. Right, so there's a radical transformation of the landscape, of the relation between people and landscape. And this is what is important to understand. And when we are talking about a Mayan village, what you have to see is that it's really dispersed in the landscape. All these yellow dots here point to a former presence of Mayan houses that were destroyed. And in red, what you see is the new settlements that the military, where these people were being concentrated. By forcing a mode of life based on a concentrated urbanization, the model village completely reorganized the landscape, fracturing social networks and disrupting traditional labor practice. Within the counterinsurgent strategy deployed by the Guatemalan army, the intentional redesign of the territory, the built and the natural environment was mobilized as a medium of violence. So we have conducted a series of field trips to this area. In trying to identify where those houses were located. In most of the situations, it's very difficult to identify the ruins of the houses, originally made of wooden or earth structures built at the top of stone foundations. The remains of these houses are dissolved mingled within the natural landscape, to the point that it's nearly impossible to distinguish the borders between the natural environment and the material ruins of the built environment.
Pasamos a analizar la parte de los recursos naturales. Ahora vemos cómo era la tenencia de la tierra antes de los años 80. Y si damos un vistazo hoy en día de lo que es la tenencia de la tierra, cruzamos los dos mapas y vemos que gran cantidad de tierras que estaban en manos de los pueblos indígenas antes de los 80, hoy en día están en manos de grandes terratenientes, de empresas y de generales que tuvieron un poder decisivo en ese momento de la violencia de los 80.
En cualquier lugar hacen una nivelación del terreno, porque por lo regular es quebrado, o sea, partes planas totalmente no hay. Entonces allá se ven los restos de ese corte, y aquí el temazcal, que siempre eso es un indicador así claro para poder localizar. Y aparte de eso, los palos de aguacate, por ejemplo, palos de aguacate o palos de durazno, como son más domésticos, ¿verdad? Entonces están en patios de casa, ¿verdad? O cercano a casa, y esos son indicadores también de dónde pudo haber existido una casa. O sea, si ellos no vivieran con nosotros, esto es claro.
As we see in this video, the dispute over appropriation and control of land was one of the most important driving forces of the conflict. But what I would like to point out, however, is not only the central role of land in the conflict, but also how land, that is to say, the natural environment, appears as a sort of archaeological resource that indexes traces of human presence. For the untrained eye, the forest may appear as an homogeneous green landscape, entirely natural in itself. But while traveling in these areas, together with the local population and experts, I have learned that the density of certain types of plants and trees, like avocado and papaya trees, are forms of ruins that are key to identify previous existence of human habitation. One needs to learn how to read the forest as a designed landscape, as similar as one knows how to interpret the syntax of architectural structures. So I'd like now to move quickly to another forest, lowland Amazonia. And I would like to stress this notion that the archaeology of the Shield territory makes visible to us the idea that the forest itself is somehow designed, not completely natural, but the product of cultivation. Cultivation, insofar as this concept implies a certain forms of social-political organization in relation to the landscape. And it's precisely this social-political landscape embedded in this form of organization that the government or the military sought to destroy. So I'm going to move rather quickly with this and start with this image. So Brazil, as most countries of Latin America, had a very particular relation with its territory, and the conquest of the territory or the colonization of the territory was perceived as a form of modernization itself. Perhaps the most important symbol of this idea between modernity and colonization is Brasilia itself, who is placed at the middle of the territory, and as the urban planner of Brasilia would say, it was born out of the primary gesture of one who marks or takes possession of a place, two axis crosses at the right angle, the very sign of the cross. That is to say, the kind of quintessential idea of what modernity would mean embodies intrinsically a colonial project of conquest of the territory. So when the military assumed power in Brazil in '64, this idea of conquest of the land became increasingly militarized. Specifically by one of a particular interpretation of the national security doctrine, which sought to convert Amazonia into a vast landscape of resource extraction that would potentially feed the economy or function as the resource of primitive accumulation of capital that would propel Brazil out of underdevelopment. And what the military really do is a kind of massive project of colonization, of which I'm going to show just some images right now. This project I call territorial design. In parallel to this program of integration, nationalization, the military implemented a program to pacify the indigenous populations who live in those territories. We need a bit of a background here on this. So, as the Brazilian government as the national frontier expanded to the interior of the country, specifically at the beginning of the 20th century, in relation to the coffee plantations and the coffee economy of Brazil, which was really the main kind of economic product, the military, there were several conflicts between the indigenous population and the expansion of the national frontier. So what the state did is to establish an agency which was called the Service for the Protection of the Indian. And the Service for the Protection of the Indian was really a kind of a frontier of the frontier, right? So it was missions that were going incursions in the territory, and they were pacifying the indigenous population and operating in a very similar manner what happened to Guatemala, establishing indigenous posts throughout the territory and kind of trying to bring them towards this posts of attraction, as they call it, in order to integrate them into the national society. And it was really a sort of, how many minutes? 5? Okay, I have to run a little bit. And it was really a kind of humanitarian sort of mission, which wanted to pacify and bring the indigenous population within the white civilization of the Brazilian territory. kind of operate in a very similar manner of what was called by the Portuguese and Spanish colonized the reductions, reducing the territory of this indigenous population. And here you see a map of the indigenous post of the Service for the Protection of the Indians, and the map of the ethno-historical map of Brazil. So it was an idea of, let's say, Brazil is a plurinational state. It was an idea of deplurinationalize the Brazilian state. When the military is in power, this program of pacification becomes increasingly militarized. And I'm going to show a specific case very quickly here, because I don't have much time, which I'm involved also in relation to the Truth Commission of Brazil, which is the case of the Waimeria Troari, a population which lives like in central Amazonia in a very strategic territory. It was one of the key areas for the government that the government sought to develop, precisely because this area, as it's marked here in this blue squares, is full of mineral resources. So the government built one of the roads that you saw is cut through the middle of the Waimeria Troari territory, and they built a large hydroelectric dam here in order to furnish energy to the mineral exploration. So here is a diagram of the process of pacification. What you can see in blue are the attraction posts where the military sought to collect the Waimeria Troari, right? So there was this pacification missions. They collect the Waimeria Troari into these posts in order to open up their lands for these large-scale programs of development. And what happened is that at the end of the process of pacification, only 342 Waimeria Troari survived. But the problem is that we don't really know how many people were there, precisely because there's no statistics, there's no demography, because the state was not there, right? So it's a project, the state was trying to implement the state apparatus there. So this process of violence, one could call it state-making violence. I'll jump this. So what we were trying to do, and I'm nearly finished here, is trying to find a way to understand the mode of inhabitation that the military sought to destroy. So we applied a methodology which is used to map carbon stocks in forest landscapes, which enables you to determine the age of the forest, that is to say, to tell the history of the forest itself. So we apply this methodology, and here you can see the age of the forest. So it's interesting to see, for example, that this area here, which for us read as a kind of green landscape, in fact, is a very recent landscape. There is a human history connected to this, right? So we apply the same methodology in the regions of the villages of the Waimeria Troari people, the existing villages. And then what you see is that the village itself is slightly larger than what you can identify in the landscape. It's because they do their agricultural fields around the village and they rotate. And then we apply in one of the regions where probably they lived in those areas. And you start to see some of these bubbles here, these very little bubbles, which are recent forests, 30 years old forests. But what one has to understand, I'm nearly finished, sorry. What one has to understand is that it's not just a small little village, fragmented, dispersed in this area, but in fact it's a whole territory which was occupied. It's a whole territory which was shaped by these people and the way that they live in this area. You know, and this ideology that the forest itself was a green landscape was in fact what motivated this process of violence of colonization. And here I conclude. Between the late 60s and the late 80s, the territory of the Waimeria Troari was subjected to a radical process of social and ecological reconfiguration, which resulted from a well-defined plan to occupy their lands. Observed against the backdrop of the history of pacification, the maps presented in this study show evidence of an orchestrated strategy whose aims were to completely transform, to the point of nearly annihilation, a mode of inhabitation that was refractory to forms of territorial control that the state sought to enforce. So resistance is very much related to the way you deal with the landscape. The maps also provide an image of Amazonia that opposed the hegemonic imaginary fostered by the military regime, according to which Amazonia was, in the words of General Goberi, an island, empty island, in need of intervention. This ideological edifice was inherited from evolutionary descriptions that portrayed Amazonia as a natural environment inhabited by fragmented collectives that exerted little, if any, influence over their surroundings. The maps here contest this ideology. Different from the industrialized collective killing that we know from the Holocaust, the forms of state violence that led to the dramatic reduction of the Waimeria-Truari population and the complete disarticulation of their modes of inhabitation follow the pattern of colonial genocides, a form of destruction distributed and fused in the lethal ecology brought alongside the frontiers of development. In this case, the definition of genocide in international law casts a broader interpretation, for it must reflect a form of violence direct both to human subjects as well as their means of spatial organization. Next to the missing persons, there are the villages that disappear. And my last second to conclude is the idea that resistance here is in relation between people and land, and the state has to transform the relation between people and land in order to implement itself, right? And the kind of ideology behind it is that this space is underdeveloped, is a space which is empty. There is to say, there's no architectural trace. It had been modified, but we need to read the landscape, the forest itself, as architecture, as a constructed landscape. And perhaps this would lead us to decolonize the way we think about nature, because most probably our idea of nature is in fact the product of colonial violence. Thank you very much.